Please put your hands together and welcome Marina Sciberras.
My name is Marina, and I will be talking to you today about representing medical conditions and diseases in games. As the title implies, a bit of a content warning, I will be talking about medical conditions, including some talk of mental health. So, a little bit about me. My background is in medicine. I graduated as a doctor and worked in the NHS for a couple of years before I transitioned. I wanted to do something a bit more creative with my life, so I transitioned into something called a medical writer, which is basically translating medical research into language that's appropriate for other doctors and people who work in the pharmaceutical industry, and most importantly, to patients and people and carers. So that's my background before I moved into games. And with that background in mind, I was always really inspired by, especially in terms of when I was a clinician, the stories of patients, and not just the illnesses that the patients had, but how this illness affected the people around them, their carers, and even wider circles from that. And I was always fascinated by that, and last year, together with my husband Duncan, we made a game and released a game called We'll Always Have Paris, which is about, you play as that guy in the mirror called Simon, and your wife has Alzheimer's disease, which is a type of dementia, and you have to get through a day, basically, together. So you can see that we got nominated for a BAFTA last year. And if you were here for Chellastalk yesterday, you will spot a bit of a pattern there. So basically, if you make a game about dementia, your odds of getting nominated are quite high. But we also exhibited the game last year at AdventureX. So some of you who were here last year may have played it. And when we were talking to people, this conversation often came up about what's unique about committing to a real-life medical condition in your game. And there are certain constraints and ideas and concepts that are quite interesting, and I'm going to try to talk to you about them in the next 30 minutes or so. I will not, unfortunately, have time to talk about medical education and the concept of how games can be applied in terms of in medicine as part of training and simulation. That's a very exciting and interesting topic, but it's just for another day, unfortunately. So there are a lot of games about aliens and about conducting trains. There are not as many games about medical conditions. As to the why, rather, I will explore that in a moment, maybe because it's a bit harder to do. Maybe there's a bit of a fear of getting it wrong. But for now, I'll say that I am sure that everyone in this room has a medical condition, at least one, right? You might not know about it yet, maybe some have really serious ones, but we all have some, or we all know someone who's dealing with a medical condition, right? And I think it's fair to say that we don't translate that or carry it over inside the game sphere. And I think that's a shame, because if we continue doing that, we will continue perpetuating this myth that diseases don't exist, right? So that's my take on it. And in terms of relatability as well, that carries over as well, because I'm pretty sure most of us will not conduct trains or even encounter aliens, but most of us will have to deal with medical conditions. So it's worth exploring, and it goes further than that. I really like this quote because illnesses are really frightening, they're isolating. Seeing yourself accurately depicted, especially within a medium like a game, can be a really powerful experience. Nothing is more intimate or personal than your health, right? At least that's how I see it. So you can take it further. It's not just about representation. It's an opportunity to really achieve something powerful with the player and for yourself as well. So we said that we don't often represent diseases in games, but when we do, and I'm talking here about mainstream games, if you see analyses of the games that came out in the last 20 years or so, physical diseases are more often depicted than mental ones for different reasons. Physical disabilities or illnesses often tend to be amputations, burns victims, ballistics, that kind of style. Again, you can see why that is. And mental illness, when they did a study about 20 years, for the most popular games in the last 20 years, about 1 in 10 of them touched upon the subject. What they did find in common in terms of the literature out there is that it will not come as a surprise to most of you, and that a lot of the representation out there is negative. It perpetuates stereotypes. In other words, there are some really good ones, and I won't go into that in this talk, but we can, in general, do better as a community. And when you think about it, in terms of like these stereotypes, think of the last few games you played, and think how often did you play a game where the main character had a disability or an illness or a physical difference, as opposed to how many times it was the antagonist who had this condition. Think of the number of times you had to run away from a Victorian mental asylum where people are out to get you and torture you, rather than the healthcare workers were on your side. Think about the treatment of, say, psychosis and severe mental health conditions. In real life, we would never treat people suffering from those conditions in the way the mechanics sometimes are in games, where the objective is to get rid of them or shut them up, or even worse, right? And I'm not saying it's always wrong to use that mechanic, but sometimes we would do well to think, that's not quite okay, and what if someone does have that condition and they're always portrayed in an antagonistic way? In We'll Always Have Paris, we had that temptation to have the healthcare workers as a mechanic out to get you, or as the antagonist. I can see how that happens. But we tried really hard to keep them on the side of the hero. I'm always going to advocate that for healthcare workers to be representing well, given my background, but I think it also makes for a new perspective, let's put it this way. Another thing, if you choose to include illness in your games or medical conditions, would be to make sure that it's not just a convenient plot device. Make sure that, just like in real life, if a character is going to have a medical condition, they exist beyond it, right? They have hopes and dreams beyond it. They have a circle of people around them who are also likely to be affected by this medical condition. And that makes it much more three-dimensional. It makes it more interesting, in my opinion. Right. In terms of the commercial, I suppose, considerations to think about when you make a game that its main subject, right, its theme is a medical disease. Commercially, We'll Always Have Paris wasn't some huge bestseller, I'm happy to say. There are things that are intrinsic to the game, like it's short, it's linear, single playthrough, but there are lots of people said to me, that sounds great, but for me, games are something that I escape from, that I want to relax. I do not want to deal with medical conditions as part of my relaxation. And I think that's fair, that's valid. It doesn't mean that if you portray a medical condition, it's going to be all doom and gloom, definitely not, but I can see that. And I've thought a lot about this. Why is there a sector of society that's really interested in a game that deals with something so heavy, or like a medical condition, and some others are just not interested? And that explains why there's chilies on my slide. It's because it's like spicy food, right? Some people love it, some people don't. It's like roller coasters. I'm quite interested in this concept of benign masochism, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's basically like disaster training for your brain. It's a concept. it tries to explain why there are some people who like chili peppers and not, basically. Your brain tries to assess, is this a safe situation for me? The answer is, if you're looking like at a safe roller coaster with security and all the safety things that they put into it, you assess it, you're like, this is going to be safe, and your brain thinks that's a fun activity for me, for some people. So you make that judgment, and then, in theory at least, your brain will know what to do if it's in real life ever encounters that situation, if that makes sense. But some people will assess that situation and judge it as it exceeds that threshold of fun for them. They'll be like, I think that's going to be a negative experience, so I'm not going to try it. And I think that's what you have to try to understand the player base is going to be like. Sometimes they will think that's going to feel too raw for me to play, so I'm not going to give it a try. One thing that's really important that I would take away from this is that what we did with We'll Always Have Paris is always communicate what it's about. So no one is going to enter the game under false pretenses and end up being disappointed. We wanted the people who liked the chili to try it, but we don't want anyone to be disappointed. And that really, I think, is fair. Right, research and medical advice. Some of you may be familiar with this. If I tell you this is a page from a book set in the real world, it's a historical novel set in real life by quite a rather famous author. So what happened here is, and he got called out quite quickly soon after it was released. This is a recipe for red dye, I believe. He did a quick Google search, and somehow it passed through the editorial process and got published that way. And in case you haven't recognized this from Zelda, of course, but so it can't really have been a historically accurate fact. And in this case, no harm done. If anything, he got some free publicity, right? Someone posted this on Twitter. He's like, oh, hey, yeah, hands up in the air. I did a quick Google. I should have checked better. I'm going to leave it that way because it's funny. But you can't do that with medical conditions, with real-life medical conditions, because the stakes are higher. The best thing that can happen is that you look a bit silly, but you could also have serious consequences if you get it wrong. And far be it from me gatekeeping, including real-life medical conditions in games. That's the opposite of what I'm saying. You do not need to have a medical degree to commit to this. All I'm saying is check your sources. There are many out there, and cross-check them, talk to people, talk to professionals if you can, and one bit of advice I have is talk to patients. There are patient groups out there who are really keen to be represented, to have their disease that they are interested in represented well. So that would be the big takeaway from this. The other note is that, like anything, but specifically medicine changes so much, as you all know. The research is coming out all the time. My medical knowledge from about 10 years ago is pretty much completely obsolete. And that's important, because even if you check really good sources and books, it's likely that it's all outdated anyway. And you have to keep this in mind, because sometimes your game will be out there, but the medical research has now so perceived it. So your game is out there, and it's not always easy to modify. So it's good to think about these things, because they're quite intrinsic to medicine itself. But definitely don't take away from this that I'm not encouraging anyone to include medical conditions, far be it. It's possible. If you include a real disease in your game, people affected from it are going to play it. Dementia is a rather common condition, but even if it's a rare game, always picture a person who suffers from it, a person who knows someone, and standing in front of you, and think, how would I feel if they are there? Am I being sensitive? Am I being fair? Am I being accurate? I don't know about you, but when there's something that I have a specialist interest or knowledge in, first thing I do is and I come across some kind of media, let's say a game, I'll be like, does this person know what they're talking about or not? It's like you want to get it out of your system, right? And that's exactly what you would do if you suffer from a medical condition. Go like, does that story represent my personal experience, or does it deviate very far? Get it wrong, and that person is going to call you out on it, but get it right, and you're going to achieve something really powerful. If they experience the game and go like, that made me understand what my parents went through, that resonated so much with my personal experience, then you can achieve something really powerful. So bearing in mind that I worked as a clinician, I will tell you that I found making Will Always Have Paris really hard, one of the hardest things I ever did. And being a doctor was really hard as well. But there is an element of dissociation, of leaving work at work. You're trained to do that. You go through things with your patients and with your colleagues, but then you kind of leave it there in a professional detachment. So I thought, I'll be fine. I'll make a game about dementia. I was inspired by my patients. That's great. But what I didn't realize, because as you all know, making a game is hard and it's intense and it takes a long time. You go there in the evening and you're working on it and you have to channel all this pain of something really hard and the hardship of the disease to make this authentic experience. And then you go the next day and you have to channel it all in. And I didn't realize that there would be a bit of a personal toll. I will be happy to say that. Not much you can do about it beyond the usual, obviously having a support network, but even just knowing about it is worth pointing out. And I will say, like, the next game I'm working on is not about medical conditions, partly because of this. It's about conducting trains, so there you go. Right. The best bit about this is that you have the chance to do something unique. There is far less tolerance from the players to accept deviations from reality. You can't have much artistic license with a serious subject like a real-life medical condition, right? You also become a bit attached to your characters. You start to wish them well. You want them to experience a bit of the hero's journey or some form of the arc, if you are here this morning. But you can't do that. You can't magically cure Alzheimer's disease, because there isn't one, and it wouldn't be that well received by the players. So you have to have a certain constraint in that realm, but then you can be creative in other ways. I say that there is one thing that in games we still do. It's this notion of the medical model of disability, which was pretty much outdated in the 70s in real life, in that the person with the disease is the problem, and instead of society changing to accommodate it, we need to fix the disease, or the person with the disease. And there is a slice of the game world that still entertains this. And that, again, that's fine. That might be a mechanic that has to be there to work. But think of the fact that, say you have an amputation, and your reward for doing something is to get a new leg or respawn or even get a superpower because you fixed your disability. And that, I'm not saying that's always wrong, but it's worth keeping in mind how that would feel if you, as a player, had some kind of limb deformity, for example. So just worth acknowledging that in the real world, that is not a valid concept anymore, or at least the medical world. But my favorite bit about making Will Always Have Paris was that the game medium really lends itself to create something special, as I was saying. You elevate the players from passive observers to an active agent, right? You can give the player the time to consider their choices and their visceral consequences. It's a way to walk a mile in the shoes of someone with a disease or with someone who loves someone with a disease. And they can conceptualize it. And you can do this not just through text, but through the game mechanic, the game mechanics, which is really ties in with what Chela was saying yesterday. In fact, if I had to do Will Always Have Paris again, I would dive even deeper into using the mechanics of the disease to explore that even further. So that's a learning for me. But it's not as easy as it sounds because it's not been done before that much. So that's a blessing and a curse. There is no canon to draw upon, or not as big as, say, a shooting mechanic, as you can appreciate. So it's fun, but it's a really, really something to tap into. And this is my last slide. Just to conclude, consider if your game could benefit from having portrayal of medical conditions. And it doesn't mean it needs to be the full game, right? It could be a character who has a medical condition within that. And then if you do choose to include it, identify appropriate resources, like you said. Then make sure your characters are going to be realistic, multidimensional, separate from their diagnosis. I can't stress this enough. Don't just make them a convenient plot device. Just make them real and exist outside of their disease. And last but not least, explore unique mechanics that can really resonate with players' experience, and you have something really magical. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. We have time for a few questions, if anyone would like to raise your hand, right at the back. Nobody at the front had a question.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent talk. You emphasised the need to represent experiences of patients and people with various conditions, and you also said that it's important to represent positive and appropriate responses and positive healthcare. Of course, many people, particularly within the mental health sphere, have experiences which are negative or disappointing with healthcare professionals. I wonder if you could speak to how to represent those experiences without either normalizing them or suggesting that's how it is for everyone.
Definitely. It's a really good opportunity to have this sort of secondary educational experience. And the point, if I got your question right, it's also about the point of view of, say, people who work within mental health and how they experience. Is that right? It's not easy. And as I say, people have really low tolerance for artistic license or making things not as their personal experience is. And in fact, for example, dementia patients tend to be very difficult, and that's something we did portray in the game about the challenges the carers would have had and the disappointments, and also the personal toll on the carers. So I think it's fair to represent it and just own it. It's what it is. And the best thing you can do is to keep cross-checking across various stages of your development with both the healthcare workers and the patients. So you're making sure that both feel that they're represented in a fair way. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Do we have another hand? You're quite near.
I had one question about how would you go about kind of representing a condition if, say, you're making a game where it's either in the past or like in a fantasy world where they might not actually be able to diagnose the condition, but you still kind of want to represent the way that person might live without the world necessarily being aware of what it means, while you yourself do as you're writing that character.
Right. Yeah, and exactly, you don't always need to be academic about it. Don't forget that a lot of us live with symptoms that maybe are being investigated, for example, and it can be very frustrating, as I'm sure a lot of us know. I have these symptoms, but no one seems to be able to make sense of them. That's a really real-life medical representation. So many medical mysteries exist. So I would say you can do that by keep acknowledging the limitations or the frustrations, or through dialogue and through mechanics that the person is suffering from, and also how it affects their ability to live in their world and how it affects the people around them. So you can have this multidimensional way, but you don't need to say what it is scientifically. And also that means you have a bit more leeway to not put your foot in it and be constrained within the label of the diagnosis. So I would absolutely recommend that. And the frustrations that come with not having a label is something that might be interesting to explore as well.
If you're happy for one more. Did I see a hand over here in this region? Oh. Oh, okay.
You mentioned that medical research is always evolving and quickly becomes obsolete. Considering how long some game dev cycles can be, how do you deal with the pitfall that, the knowledge that once you're done with the game, all your research may have gone out the window? Yeah,
that's a very good question, very good point. So medical research can be quicker, basically, than the development cycle in a game. I would say, as a caveat to what I said, in terms of understanding of diseases, that tends to be quite slow, sometimes glacially slow. It's more treatment that tends to be evolving. So one thing you could do to be smart about it, if you think it's going to keep, some fields change more than others, would be to keep the treatment part of things, if it works with your mechanic, more broad and lighter in terms of don't commit to putting doses if you don't need to, because they might be out of date. But in terms of our understanding of diseases, you'd be probably surprised how slowly that reacts, and I would be willing to bet that the game development cycle is more. So in terms of symptoms, our understanding of diseases, anatomy, those things are quite old. But yeah, you have to be smart about it, and you have to keep, or you can just make sure that this is time-bound. Like in this, if it's set in the present day, you make it clear that today's treatment would recommend this, for example, and then you can, it's a bit of a disclaimer. And general disclaimers, you can never go wrong as well. You say, this was correct as of the time that this was published, and then you give a bit more responsibility to the players out there.
Thank you very much, Marina Sciberras.